If you'll please be seated, I'll introduce our next speaker. I'm Justin Hagel, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Troy Ertelt. Ertelt, thank you. He is a clinical psychologist, assessment and therapy associated at Grand Forks. He attended the University of Minnesota Moorhead and received his doctoral training here at the University of North Dakota. He completed his pre-doctoral internship as the chief psychology intern at the Ohio Psychology Internship, and he serves his community at the University of North Dakota as a professor in the Department of Psychology and the School of Medicine. As part of his day-to-day practice, Dr. Ertelt conducts psychological evaluations of juveniles and adults in legal matters ranging from child custody disputes to competency of pro se litigants. As part of his work in providing evaluations and testimony in criminal matters, Dr. Ertelt does risk assessments of persons convicted of physical or sexually violent crime and determines whether they have the propensity to commit future violent crimes or exhibit any dangerous behaviors. Today, he's here to discuss 3 different approaches in assessing violent risk of offenders, the strengths and weaknesses of each type of assessment, and give legal practitioners a frame of reference in evaluating the credibility of expert testimony in violent risk assessments. On behalf of the North Dakota Law Review and the University of North Dakota School of Law, I want to thank him for coming to speak with us today. And with that, Dr. Troy Ertelt.
Okay, well, thank you guys for having me today. I'm excited to be here. I think this should be hopefully an informative talk for everybody. It'll probably be a little bit different than what you guys have had exposure to so far today. But what I want to talk kind of broadly about is really, in some ways, I'm kind of cramming 3 lectures together into one so that I can give you broad exposure in a bunch of different areas, or well, 3 different areas, that I think are really important about the interaction between law and psychology. I want to spend some time today talking about how we communicate risk to each other. I want to talk about today how we determine risk for future offending in domestic violence offenders and sex offenders. And I want to spend some time talking about the best ways that attorneys can use expert witnesses who are trained psychologists to assist in their cases. But the first question I want to ask you guys is, how do you interpret this statement? There's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. Do you interpret it as A, that it will rain for 30% of the day tomorrow? Do you think that it could mean B, that it will rain in 30% of the region tomorrow? Or do you think that C, it means it will rain on 30% of days that are like tomorrow? You don't have to raise your hand or anything, but just think for a second about what that statement means. We see statements like that all the time. The answer is actually C, that it will rain on 30% of days that are like tomorrow, that have conditions that are similar to what the conditions will be tomorrow. But in research, we have learned that most people don't really understand how to interpret that very basic probability statement. We're exposed to statements like that every day. Every day of the week, we probably turn on the news or look at the newspaper and read that statement, and probably 2/3 of Americans don't know how to interpret that kind of statement. So when we extend that into what I'm going to talk about today with risk assessment and risk communication, we see that there are a lot of instances where we communicate in a very similar way, and most people, from professionals to the lay public, don't understand what those probabilities really mean. So everyone is probably about ready to fall asleep because they think we're going to talk about probabilities and statistics, but I promise that's not exactly what we're going to talk about today. We'll also talk about gory details of sex crimes because that, I think, tends to be more interesting for people. But really, we'll spend some time talking about how we communicate risk. How do we talk about probabilities and risk in our culture in a way that confuses us? And why do we as members of this culture or society have a hard time understanding risk? Then we'll spend some time talking about exactly how risk is identified from a forensic psychological perspective. We'll take a look at 3 prevailing schools of thought that have developed over sort of the relatively short history of risk assessment in psychology, and how risk factors and risk and harm are determined by psychologists. And then we'll take a look at some special issues related to recidivism with sexual offenders and domestic violence offenders. And then finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about a framework for the best use of expert witnesses with a background in psychology and how that can be best utilized to assist in different kinds of cases. So let's take a look at how we understand risk. The reality is that people are not very good at understanding the risks they face. When I say risk, really, I mean, we're not just talking about being a victim of a violent crime, but of getting sick or having a terminal illness, or what your outcome will be if you go to your physician and he says you have X diagnosis and here's what the typical outcome is, or being in a car accident or an airline accident. Anything that we think that we could be at risk for, we naturally don't understand, and there are some reasons why we have a difficult time understanding it. Something that's important to keep in mind is that it's not because there's some kind of deficit in the lay public, or in which many of us ultimately would be included in, depending on where we stand in the risk communication equation. Ultimately, risk is improperly communicated by professionals also. So professionals don't do a very good job of communicating it, and as the receiver, the public doesn't do a good job of understanding what it means. Risk is really presented to us in 3 different kinds of ways. Don't worry, I'm just going to talk about one. But we learn about risk in the terms of single event probabilities, in terms of relative risk, and in terms of joint probabilities or conditional probabilities. And we'll spend some time talking about single event probabilities because I think that they're probably the most relevant to domestic violence offender assessment and sex offender risk assessment. So those are we'll look mostly at single event probabilities today. So a single event probability is the probability that X event will occur at Y%. So it might be that there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow, so the event would be rain and the percent is 30. It might be something like the operation has an 80% survival rate. So the event would be the operation, the survival rate would be 80%. Or it might be something more closely related to what I'm talking about today. Mr. Johnson has a 15% chance of committing future sexually violent acts. So it would be sexually violent acts as the event and 15% as the percent. So these kinds of single event probabilities are presented to us in a variety of settings in an array of different ways, but ultimately they all kind of have the same underlying principles. There you go, okay. So the first thing that we need to know about a single event probability is that unless the probability of the event is either 0 or 1, a single event probability by itself can never be proven wrong. There's no way to prove wrong that tomorrow there's a 30% chance of rain. I mean, we certainly have it in our heads that maybe that is true, but there's no way to prove that that's an inaccurate statement. If it does rain, then that was the 30% we expected it would rain. If it doesn't rain, there's the 70% where it wasn't going to rain. There's no way to prove it wrong. What we can do as communicators of risk is present our findings in a way that isn't a single event probability, but talk in terms of frequency. So we can't prove wrong the statement that there is a 30% chance of rain tomorrow, but what can be proven wrong is the statement, it will rain on 10 days in October. We would simply have to measure the number of days that it rains throughout the month. It might snow 7 days in November. Same thing, we just have to measure the number of days that it takes place, and that can either be true, proven to be correct, or false, proven to be incorrect. Another problem with single event probabilities is that so often they're presented without a reference class. So let's take a look at what that means. With the example that the operation has an 80% survival rate. But who in here, if you heard that statement from your doctor, would say, okay, that sounds pretty good, I'm going to do that? Or does it seem like you would need more information to make an informed decision about your health? I would argue you need more information because you don't know what the reference class is. You don't know how long the survival rate period is in that statement. It might just mean that you will wake up after surgery, but you could still drop dead the next day. It could mean that you'll survive for 6 months or a year following surgery, but because it isn't explicitly stated, we don't know. And the problem is that people fill in their own reference class because we all have a different frame of reference when we approach a problem. So another example I think that is that's pretty easy to wrap our heads around is that psychiatrists and family medicine physicians routinely prescribe Prozac or fluoxetine. As it's an antidepressant. It's used to treat depression and anxiety and related disorders. And there have been a number of studies about how people understand their risks of side effects. So if a psychiatrist says to you, there's a 30 to 50% chance that you will experience sexual side effects when you begin taking Prozac. How do you interpret that? Because most patients interpret that as they will experience difficulty engaging in sexual activity in 30 to 50% of their personal sexual encounters. The psychiatrist or the physician means that 30 to 50% of my patients will have difficulties in sexual functioning when they take this medicine. But because the patient's frame of reference, their reference class, is just the person, they're only worried about themselves, they implicitly assume that it applies to them. The psychiatrist or the physician has in his or her mind their entire patient panel and all the research that they've read about these things. And so they're not thinking about just this individual patient, but all of this entire group of patients. So we need to think about what the reference class is, and we need to be more explicit about it, because when people fill it in on their own, they often make mistakes, and that leads to errors, and that leads to problems in how we interpret these probabilities. If the event is unique with few or no known comparison cases, then any predictions that we make with a single event probability about that rare, unique, special event ultimately are just guesses. If we don't have enough of a comparison group, really all we're doing is guessing. Let's take a look at sort of a case example. Mr. Johnson has a 15% chance of committing another sexual offense. But before we can really determine whether or not there are comparable cases, we probably need to know something more about Mr. Johnson. We need to understand his reference class first. So his reference class would be contained in his scenario. Let's say he's a 72-year-old, never married Caucasian man who has no previous arrests and no history of psychiatric disturbance, who was found with 10 images of child pornography. Now that sounds like sort of an unusual case, doesn't it? For an elderly man with no criminal record to be detected with child pornography. It seems a little unusual. And we know that in the literature about risk assessment, that many of these factors that we'll take a look at as we're going through today, many of these factors are salient. His age, his racial group, his gender, of course, is an important one, his history of criminal and psychiatric difficulties, and what his offense is. So we know that what the reference class should be, and ultimately, what we learn is that many, probably, and you know, what we learn, because you'll just have to take my word for it, but many of the important aspects of Mr. Johnson's case upon examination really indicate that this is a rare or unique case where we probably will mostly be guessing, because there aren't a lot of cases like it. And then in that case, we really have to be quite careful, I think, in the statements that we're making that will affect, that from the expert witness or the forensic psychologist perspective, the statement that we make predicting this individual's risk and how we would try to influence a judge or a jury about making decisions about this person's liberty moving forward. So let's take a look at how forensic psychologists assess risk. How do we determine risk? Just briefly, in the 1980s, psychologists really started to get into assessing dangerousness. That's not really a term that's used in psychology anymore, but it tends to still be used in legal terminology. What is this person's dangerous to self or dangerousness to others, things like that. Psychologists have sort of broken it down because that's what we really like to do, is make it certainly more complicated than it needs to be. But we've broken dangerousness into three categories, really. We talk about risk, which is the likelihood of violence, risk factors, which are variables that predict violence, and harm, which is the degree of violence. In the psychological research literature, harm has received substantially less attention compared to risk and risk factors. But in a lot of cases, people use them synonymously, and sometimes they conflate them in a way that can get really confusing, ultimately. So if you have a good expert witness testifying about in like a sexually dangerous individual committal case, that expert witness probably should be explaining to the judge what the difference is between risk and risk factor, and if it becomes salient, what harm means. So the first movement in the 1980s was, well, we feel like we need to do this, and we don't really have a good way of doing it. So we'll just use our clinical judgment. Based on our education, training, and experience, psychologists and psychiatrists, we believe that we should be able to answer questions about people's dangerousness, or what later came to be known as risk and risk factors. There are no formal rules in making a clinical judgment. There are no guidelines on how it might be done, and the base rate is not formally accounted for. Now, base rate is another statistical term probably everyone's had some exposure to, but base rate at its simplest really means the likelihood that an event will occur in a certain population. So the base rate of reoffending among child pornography offenders to commit a future child pornography violation would be between 4 and 7%. So but the base rate is important to take into account, because if the base rate is a rare event, then it's going to be really hard to make predictions about how frequently it will occur. So we need to take into account the base rate, and clinical judgment doesn't do that. Also, clinical judgment is probably influenced by graphic details of violence and things like that are included in investigation notes, and that can be problematic largely because some arresting officers may not take very good notes and some might take very explicit notes. But should that sort of difference ultimately change the way that people think about risk, or change the way that an assessor thinks about risk? I don't think it should. So currently, most professional standards would say that simple clinical judgment without any aided assessment instruments would be inappropriate. So if you were ever to be in court and see an expert witness saying, you know, I just feel it in my gut, and probably that, well, you know what, I was going to say probably they wouldn't do that, but I promise you that there are some old school people out there who will say things like that, and it's highly problematic, and it's probably a violation of, minimally, of their professional ethics code. It's not appropriate anymore, because we have instruments that can help us make those decisions in a better way. What started to become popular in the 1990s is something called actuarial assessment. These are really instruments that are empirically derived, that ultimately it is a research team taking a sample of maybe 400 or 600 violent offenders and taking a look at all the stuff that's in their chart from the correctional institution and coding them all into a big database and then running a bunch of statistical analyses to see what emerges as a factor that appears predictive. And for a while people, and even still really, people were really excited about these things. Because the idea was, finally, we have something that will tell us who is going to do it again. And we can make some really good estimates about who's going to do it again. And then we can decide who needs longer sentences, or who needs longer supervision in the community, who is more dangerous, who is more at risk. And people were really excited about these things. And ultimately, there is some value, I think, some legitimate value in offering a probability risk assessment at the end. This person is a moderate risk to reoffend, and that's associated with a 27% likelihood that he will reoffend in the next 10 years. So there is some value in that, kind of, because as we saw, when you talk about a single event probability, most people don't really understand what that means. And we need more information, really, to make a reasoned judgment. One real strength of this that I think is important from the expert witness perspective, and I think important for legal professionals, is that this is a transparent process. So you will have a list of 10 questions that you've answered where the scoring rules are reasonably clear, although not as clear as they would argue, the developers of these tests. You know how the person, the expert, has answered them, and everyone in the room knows how it was answered. So there's nothing in the black box of the clinician mind. Everything is on paper for you. The other benefit then is that it's very efficient. It's really efficient to pull someone's file and answer 10 questions about them and their history. Some would argue that you shouldn't even be doing an interview with these kind of risk assessments because that accidentally introduces clinical judgment. And so it's so efficient, in fact, that eventually they started saying, we don't need a doctor to do this. Parole agents can do it. Probation officers can do it. But what we see ultimately is that as that happens, when people have less and less training in sort of judgment and reason and logic and decision making and the statistics that underlie these tests, that they become less and less valid. And of course, I'm giving you a preview of the weakness slide. But this is a quote that I really like. The use of an equation or algorithm can never capture the richness and full complexity of the phenomenon it's meant to predict. So the reality is, and I know that this, some of this is, you know, like if you've never seen one before, or never been involved in a case where one is used, then you may not be 100% familiar with the idea, but ultimately what it does is boil down a person's life to 10 items, maybe 16, in one case 4. There's an instrument called the razor that is only 4 items, and for a while that was all the rage. To think about how old this person is, how many previous offenses, if they've ever been married, and I can't even remember the other one. And then we should make a determination about that person's life moving forward based on 4 items in their history. It seems a little silly, ultimately, to me, to only include that. I can see the value of actuarial assessment, but what I have hinted at is that these typically focus on historical factors. So once you have your score on one of these instruments, your score never goes down because your history never changes. The only way that your score can go down is that on some of the assessments, they are not interested in your age at first offense, they're interested in your age at the time of release. And so as you get older, it's less likely that you will commit a violent crime. And you, in some cases, can get a lower score simply by getting older. But that's the only way it happens. The other problem is that while it's all well and good, ultimately, to look at these historical factors that are predictive of functioning in the future, nothing about these assessment instruments is intervention-based. So for a domestic violence offender or a sex offender who comes into contact with the law, they receive this instrument from a probation officer, ultimately now, or perhaps in a psych eval. And nothing about this instrument suggests anything about what to do moving forward. It doesn't suggest that maybe this person could successfully complete treatment in the community, or this person's history is such that he would have to complete treatment in a highly structured setting. It doesn't tell us anything about intervention, and I think that's a problem. And as we've kind of talked about, they're less accurate when predicting rare events. The other thing that's really important to think about, and think about the reference class issue. Most people who give these risk assessments don't understand what the normative group or the reference class is. So the reference class for almost all of these is usually adult men, not usually, always adult men who have been incarcerated following a violent offense. Either a generally violent offense like a bar fight, in some cases a domestic violence offense, and in some cases a sexually violent offense. Always these are people that have been incarcerated, presumably of normal intelligence, often from other countries. There actually are, of the most commonly used instruments, none of them were initially developed in the United States. Almost all of them come from Canada and the United Kingdom because of different federal funding issues. So then we have to say, how well does this instrument apply to this person? And the reality is that in some cases it may not apply all that well. And especially for, we know that clinicians, and the general public for sure, and clinicians also, wildly underestimate the likelihood that a woman will engage in a violent act. Women are still much less likely to engage in violent acts than men, but they certainly do it at a rate that outpaces our estimates. And there are no risk assessments for women. We know that people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities are at least somewhat likely to engage in violent behavior, but there are no instruments that were developed for use with this population. And if you were to go up to Grafton at the State Developmental Center, you will see a lot of registered sex offenders who have had these instruments applied to them inappropriately somewhere along the line. So let's take a really quick look at some of the items that are included. So we've talked kind of about what the strengths or weaknesses are of these instruments, but let's take a look at this one. It's the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide, the VRAG. And this is routinely used in some jurisdictions with domestic violence offenders. So the items are all historically based, as we'll see. Did this person live with his parents until the age of 16, excuse me? Were there problems with behavior in elementary school, a history of alcohol problems, marital problems? What's the criminal history like for nonviolent offenses, including property crimes or burglary? Has this person had previous failures on conditional release? How old was this person at the time of the index offense? Was the victim injured? Was the victim a woman? Does this person have a history of diagnoses for a personality disorder or schizophrenia? And what was this person's score on something called the psychopathy checklist revised that we won't get into? But you can see that none of those change after you get them the first time. So, because they're all historical. Now this one, Static 99, if you've ever worked on any sex offender related case, you certainly have had exposure to this. It's exceptionally popular. And these are the items on the Static 99, these 10 items. What's the person's age? Has this person ever lived with an intimate partner for at least 2 years? Any convictions for non-sexual violence? Any non-sexual violence that's involved in the index offense? So did this person use force, coercion, threats, or weapons? Ultimately, prior sex offenses, prior sentencing dates, prior, convictions for non-contact sex offenses, something like exhibitionism or voyeurism. Let me know if you're not familiar with those terms. And any unrelated victims, stranger victims, or male victims. All of these things are historical, some related to the offense, some related to the person. And what you also might notice when you're looking at those items is that they tend to double dip. So if an individual were to find an unrelated stranger victim, because an unrelated victim might be like your best friend's child. A stranger victim would also be unrelated, and if someone were to find an unrelated stranger victim who was a boy, suddenly they have all those points. Even I standing right here right now, having never been convicted of a crime ever, have a few points on here because of my age and my marital status. So simply by virtue of being male and not being married or cohabiting, I have a couple points on there. And being under, I think, 34 is and I'm quite a bit under 34. But in case anyone was wondering, you weren't, but I want to insist that I am. But just by virtue of those points, I would have a few points. And so let's pretend that it's misapplied to me. The other thing to keep in mind with these instruments is that your risk is never zero. Just by even if I got a score of 0, my risk of reoffending on some of these instruments, not the two that I've shown you, but my risk of reoffending on some popularly used instruments would be about 14%. How is that possible with a score of 0? It's possible because the normative group, the group it's based on, even for guys that got a 0, still 14% of them went out and committed another crime. And so that's why we really have to think about how we want to use these instruments and how they are applied. So let's take a look at the third broad risk assessment idea, or concept, excuse me. It's called structured professional judgment. The strengths are that the risk factors are empirically derived, they're clearly defined, and that they allow for the inclusion of what we would call dynamic or future-oriented risk factors. So they're not strictly historical. They're also risk management oriented. So before we looked at something that didn't really have anything to do with intervention, but now we're thinking about how are we going to manage risk moving forward. And another important issue is that this uses a descriptive risk estimate, which sometimes people understand better, low, moderate, and high, than they would understand a probability estimate, but that can also be a weakness, as we'll see. Some of the weaknesses is that ultimately the scoring is subjective. So we'll take a look at the items in just a second, but you ultimately are marking, was this clearly absent, maybe present, or clearly present when you look at an item. And how I define maybe present and how someone else defines clearly present could be very different. And so it's important to keep this in mind. Also, the weighting of the final judgment is really an important thing because how I define moderate risk or high risk could be different from how you define moderate or high risk. And then we really need to be clear with each other about how these terms are defined. There's no probability statement associated with a structured professional judgment instrument. So although probability estimates are not well understood by most members of the public or even other professionals, it still is a useful tool if we explain it in the right way. The other weakness is something called clinical override. So because there is not a formal scoring rule exactly for these kinds of instruments, I could give you the instrument with all 20 items, and you could only have one that was clearly present, and the other 19 are absent. And I could say, that is so dangerous, that is such a big risk factor for this guy, you're high risk. And so people certainly can do that because it's within the rules of how the instrument is scored. And then we verge dangerously close to clinical judgment that is informed by gut instinct instead of by empirical factors. So we'll take a look really quickly at one that is used, the structured professional judgment tool that's used with domestic violence offenders. It's called the HCR20. HCR stands for Historical, Clinical, and Risk Factors. The historical factors are very similar to what we've looked at before. History of violence, when did it start? History of alcohol problems, early maladjustment, those kinds of things are all included here. Substance use, mental health problems, psychopathy or antisocial personality issues, which maybe some of you have had exposure to or have yourself. That was for sure a joke, I promise, but it's, but maybe it just sounded really serious, I don't know. But then when we move past the historical factors, we see that there are some clinical factors and some risk management factors that we can consider here. So there's more flexibility to think about this person moving forward. So the clinical factors that would be risk factors include a lack of insight, negative attitudes about treatment, active symptoms of a major mental illness. So maybe this person has a history of bipolar disorder and is also currently in a hypomanic state. And so that would be a risk factor that we would need to consider. Is this person highly impulsive, so they make decisions without thinking? Is this person unresponsive or resistant to treatment? And then we can think about risk management. So is this a person whose plans include, after 4 violent convictions, going to law school, for example? Perhaps that's not a very realistic plan. Does he, or, well, they really are for men, does he live in an environment that is unstable, so he lacks personal support? And he's been exposed to some destabilizing agent like loss of a job or becoming housing unstable. Is he non-compliant with parole or probation? And is there any other kind of stress? So we can think about these risk management factors, and I think that's really important. When we move it to sex offenders, the psychosexual adjustment, or excuse me, psychosocial adjustment, is ultimately the same as the historical factors that we've looked at. I won't bore you with all these because they're very much similar to what we've kind of talked about for other historical factors. But let's take a look at how this instrument in particular breaks down factors that are associated with the actual sex offense. This one measures what's called high-density sexual offending. So did a lot of sex offenses take place in a short amount of time? Are there different types of sex offenses? So is this someone who is exposing himself and engaging in online solicitation and looking at child pornography and has a contact sex offense? Are there different kinds of sex offenses in there? Because that's a big risk factor. Are there different kinds of sexual deviance present? So if this person is a pedophile and also has something that we call hebephilia, that's kind of controversial, it's sexual attraction to early adolescence, those ultimately are 2 different kinds of sexual deviance. And when multiple paraphilias are present, that's a big risk factor. Was there use of a weapon or physical force? Of course, we can all recognize that as a big risk factor. Was there escalation in frequency or severity of offending? So did this person go from committing 1 offense a year to 5 in a month? And we really have to keep that kind of thing in mind. And the other actuarial instruments don't allow us to do that. Also, does this person extremely minimize his behavior? And are there attitudes that support sex offending? The most popular one that I come across in attitudes that support sex offending is that pedophilia is normal orientation to children and it shouldn't be a crime to have sex with a child. So that would be a definitely present score. And then that's really an important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this person's treatment moving forward. In some ways, it can actually be sort of helpful because they acknowledge that they've engaged in the sex crime, although they don't believe it was wrong. They've acknowledged it, so you don't have to fight with them in treatment about whether or not it took place. But then that's a really deeply entrenched cognitive distortion that you have to work through in a different way. So, you know, you split your difference and try to find a strength and a point to start from. And then we talk about future plans, or what would be risk management strategies. So does this person have feasible plans for the future, and does this person have a negative attitude toward intervention? So the static variables, those are the historic variables, but you can see that through all of those different instruments, regardless of if it's actuarial or if it's a structured professional judgment instrument, regardless of what, if it's for domestic violence or general violence or sexual violence, the static variables, ultimately there's a theme that runs through all of them. Was there antisocial or bad behavior as a child or adolescent? What was the age of the first conviction? How many times have you been incarcerated or convicted before? Have you failed supervision attempts in the past? Things of that nature. Dynamic variables are really variables that can change and are related to risk moving forward. So they could be employment problems, financial problems, family problems. Are they currently in the throes of a substance use disorder? Do they currently have active symptoms of a major mental illness? Are they quite resistant to treatment? Do they have crime-tolerant attitudes, or do they live in a neighborhood, or perhaps even at the more micro level, a household that supports engaging in crime? And how do those things influence this individual moving forward? But the way that I think of it, that I like to think of it, even though we have all these different factors and a million studies to tell us about all of these things that are related to some degree or another as far as risk assessment goes, I think of it, I really like this little analogy. They call it the broken leg in psychological research, or in this particular area. A man rode his bicycle daily so that his behavior could be predicted with great accuracy, except on the day he broke his leg. On that date, special unique knowledge about the broken leg was required to predict accurately. And so what that really means is that we can have all of the information we want about population-based studies, but we still need to take a look at the individual in that context. That really is what that means, that we need to take a look at the unique risk factors that are present for this individual. So the way that I approach risk assessment, it's described in the literature as a sort of more recent movement called integrated actuarial. So it tries to take information from all of the different approaches as far as an actuarial assessment, and then thinking about dynamic assessment, and then thinking about what are recommendations for treatment and what are recommendations for risk management in the future. So we'll take a look at a case that has a few of these different components present, and we'll take a look at how a psychological expert who's doing this kind of evaluation will walk through each of these different steps. So for this example, we'll take a look at Joe, who is 38 years old and never married, although he did cohabit with a partner for 7 years. He's Caucasian and he has no previous violent convictions. He does, however, have previous convictions for issuing a check without an account and for driving under suspension, so no violent convictions. He also has had long-term uninterrupted employment. He was working at a restaurant for like 14 years as the busboy or something like that. So although it perhaps was not a high-achieving position, it was uninterrupted. However, Joe was convicted of possession of child pornography. So that was sort of the offense that brought him into contact with the law. And upon evaluation and upon obtaining local law enforcement records, it also became clear that Joe had some other problems that hadn't gotten him arrested, but were clearly a concern. He had a history of making obscene phone calls, and he was never charged, but he would do things like call honor students whose pictures were in the paper and give them a call and tell them just how beautiful they were. So nothing criminal, ultimately, but inappropriate and problematic nonetheless. He would engage in sexually explicit chat room and blog post kinds of things with other people looking at child pornography. And he even on one occasion met an adolescent girl who perhaps he was sexually interested in, although there was no sexual contact alleged by her or admitted by him, but clearly problematic nonetheless. He had clear evidence of a few different kinds of paraphilic disorders, sexual interest in children, sexual interest in early adolescence, and sexual interest in body parts in isolation of the body. So we won't get into that. But, and he also had significant alcohol dependence. Although he never had a DUI or anything like that, that's ultimately because he worked a few blocks from where he lived, and the bar was a few blocks from where he worked and lived. So he just walked around and didn't really have to worry about those things, never went to treatment, really until 38 years of age, was never in contact with the law very much. So the thing is that when you go to do, and this is one of the things where I really want to emphasize the reference class issue. For a child pornography offender, there really aren't any actuarial assessment instruments that were developed specifically for them. So you really have to reach, and you really have to be very careful when you're looking at these instruments and applying them to people that they weren't fully really developed for. There is one instrument called the Risk Matrix 2000 that in some instances, in some studies, it has had demonstrated predictive validity. So in this case, that's what I used. But even in the context of all of those behaviors, which in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you know, although he's only been arrested for child pornography, he has a lot of other behavior that verges in the direction of a contact sex offense that clearly is sexually deviant. There are some significant problems here. But with this particular actuarial assessment, he was a low-risk offender. However, that's when we take the next step to go to dynamic factors and structured professional judgment. So I use the SVR-20, the thing that we looked at the items for, and there, because of his substance use and multiple paraphilias and history of additional kinds of inappropriate sexual behavior and the frequency with which they were occurring and that they were occurring more often and closer together, it would be appropriate to judge him as somewhere between moderate and high. So in this case, a lot of times the criticism, and this is a kind of a fine-grained criticism that may not always apply a ton to what you guys need to know, but a lot of times people say that actuarial assessment goes high and structured professional judgment goes low, if you had to rank them. But it also is possible that an actuarial assessment will say this person is low risk, but there are things about this person that aren't captured by the actuarial assessment instrument that need to be considered in thinking about the risk that this person poses to the public moving forward. So when I was talking about treatment recommendations, ultimately I said this person probably needs group and individual treatment, and it needs to be sex offender treatment and substance use treatment. Because ultimately he really was drinking a lot, probably 5 to 6 nights a week. And so there's, you know, of course, what does he say? He says, well, I only ever did it when I was drunk. But if you're always drunk, it's really hard to disentangle when things are happening. So both need to be managed, and they need to be managed concurrently. Also, he ultimately had a reasonably long, stable history as far as employment and housing, and so upon his release, he could have treatment delivered to him in a community-based setting after his sentence, whatever it should be. And then when we think about risk management strategies moving forward, some of these are really hard, but ultimately there's no reason that we shouldn't try. This is a person who shouldn't have access to the internet. If we look at his behavior, he was offending through the internet as much as anywhere else. He met this adolescent girl online and then arranged a meeting. He obtained child pornography online. He had friends who were in different parts of the country and even different parts of the world who he was talking about child pornography and sexual interest in children with, all online. So ultimately, he probably shouldn't have access to the internet because it's just a huge risk factor for him and it puts other people at risk. This is someone who probably should have some kind of alcohol monitoring system in place all the time because of how long he was drinking so much. So maybe that means that he needs to go especially for the first year after his release probably, to make sure that he doesn't have a relapse. So maybe he needs to go do a breathalyzer with his probation agent at 7 in the morning and 7 at night, whatever the case may be, to make sure that he does not fall back into relapse and then put the public at risk again. And finally, his telephone calls need to be monitored very, very closely so that he can't be engaging in obscene phone calls. And maybe his probation officer or parole agent, whatever the case might be, gets a list of all the calls he makes in a month and goes through and figures out who they were to, so that that all of his phone calls are made for a purpose. So let's talk a little bit about risk of recidivism in sex offenders. So recidivism going back to a sex crime. When we look at this table, it presents some sort of bleak numbers. But when we break it down by offense type, we see that certain groups reoffend at a much higher rate than others. So this sample is based on a meta-analysis. That's a statistical concept where you take people from lots of different samples that were collected over time at different places, and hopefully their outcome measures are very similar. And so in this instance, they were able to get about 4,700 sex offenders into one study and really look at 5, 10, and 15 years after index offense, what was the reoffense rate like? And so, so you guys can certainly read the numbers there. What I would draw your attention to, what is interesting, and what is actually consistent with literature about treatment for sex offenders is that incest offenders respond better to treatment than other kinds of offenders. And there are certainly a lot of proposed mechanisms of action for that, but for some reason, incest offenders respond better to treatment and ultimately are at lower risk to reoffend. Although they certainly have risk to reoffend, it's lower than other groups of sex offenders. The most likely to reoffend are men who have offended against children who are boys. So if you are a child molester who had a male victim, you are much more likely to reoffend than other groups of sex offenders. And there are sort of etiological or causal pathways for that sort of thing in the literature also that I won't bore you with. But ultimately, it's an important factor to keep in mind. And if we think back to what we saw as the items on some of those risk assessment instruments, we saw, was this victim male? Was this person related or unrelated? And so this is where we start to see that some of this research is related to how these instruments were developed. Another one that comes up all the time, that comes up increasingly, certainly in the federal system, and for me for evaluation and for sex offender groups, is child pornography. And so this really is an important issue, I think, because it has become so much more prevalent, or perhaps minimally that we see it so much more often. So there have been a few studies measuring recidivism risk in child pornography offenders. However, the outcome periods are much shorter than what we've seen for contact offenders. So the best studies in this area measure reoffense risk for a 1.5 to 6 year period after the index offense. And so the risk of a child pornography offender committing a new contact offense up to 6 years after the index child pornography offense is between 2% and 4%. So it's reasonably low. And recidivism here is defined by, in these studies with these researchers, recidivism is refined by conviction. So, so ultimately we also know that that estimate is low because of all the different ways that things can be dispensed. For committing another child pornography offense, it's probably between about 3.5% and 7%. So it's higher than a contact offense, but still, especially I would argue, given the secrecy that's involved in child pornography and the sophistication with which some of these men obtain child pornography and hide it, it certainly is an underestimate. But on the flip side, there is something that is that's highly controversial among forensic psychologists called the Butner study. And what that basically, what the background on that is it's a study that said about 3/4 of adult men who were incarcerated on child pornography offenses had a previous contact sex offense victim that law enforcement didn't know about. But when we look more closely at that study, there are some methodological flaws that really call its results into question. It's based on 54 people who were all enrolled in a treatment program in a prison. And the treatment program was set up such that, that it's been criticized by many as being a coercive environment where indicating that you had a previous contact victim would allow you to advance to another treatment level. So there would be privileges associated with that statement. And ultimately that was because of the beliefs of the psychologist who was running the program. So as soon as you can get past your denial and admit this victim, you can move on in a level. So we know ultimately that a lot of people can be induced to say they've done things that they haven't done if they're in a coercive or kind of involuntary situation. The other problem is that this study was never in a peer-reviewed academic journal. It was actually presented at a conference in 2001 by the psychologist from Butner in North Carolina, and he was pretty impressed with his results, I guess, and distributed the results to other attendees at the conference. And then it became sort of, you maybe have seen papers that say things like, as cited in, or cited from a poster presentation at a conference or a lecture at a conference. And those are really problematic because they're not widely disseminated, they're not peer-reviewed, but he basically distributed his white paper and it caught on, and then people, it really actually is a very interesting story about how different people at different levels of government got a hold of it and believed it to be something that had gone through the peer review process and that it was scientifically sound, and suddenly someone is testifying in front of Congress about it. So, so this particular issue comes up with reasonable frequency, and it's important to, if you ever hear it, to know that there are lots of problems with this particular stuff. It really is sort of an exercise in how we need to check our facts for ourselves. Like this is why I teach at the family medicine residency up the road here, and I always encourage the physicians, when you're reading someone's study, the first thing you should do before you even read the abstract is see who paid for it. flip to the back and see what the author's conflicts of interest are. That's the first thing you need to understand before you can be a legitimate consumer of research. And so that's what, I mean, that's ultimately what we all need to do, is think about what other factors could be involved here. Who's paying for this? We need to follow the money if we're going to really understand where that research comes from. I'm running super short on time, but one thing I would like to really quickly talk about a little bit, because I haven't focused much on domestic violence. And Lloyd Rath is here today. You guys probably saw him this morning, and I used to work with Lloyd at CVIC doing domestic violence offender groups. And so that's an issue that is particularly dear to me because of the human suffering that's associated with it. But if we were to ask the question, what is the recidivism risk in domestic violence offenders, I wouldn't be able to answer it. Because in a way that is different from sex offenders, domestic violence offenders don't receive the same attention in the psychological research literature. Even though it's a widely recognized social problem, even though we know that there are terrible outcomes for people who are exposed to it, for women and children and families, ultimately it doesn't receive the same level of interest from the psychological literature. And I think that's really unfortunate. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that for these risk assessment tools, there are researchers who have tried to develop them specifically for domestic violence offenders, but ultimately those specifically developed instruments are not any better at making predictions about future violence than instruments that are developed for just general offenders. And that's, you know, what that says is that we don't know enough, and we need to probably, as a research community, do a better job of understanding the characteristics of who these men are. One thing that comes up occasionally is how would you predict spousal homicide? Because that, I mean, that is the terror in every domestic violence case, that it will get to a point where a woman is killed by her partner. The unfortunate part is that spousal homicide is ultimately such a low base rate event. It occurs with such infrequency. I mean, I guess, thank God that it occurs with infrequency. But it's so infrequent that we can't make good predictions about it. We can't make good predictions about what man would be at a greater risk to kill his partner, or what woman would be at greater risk to be killed by her partner. But there are some studies that pull out some risk factors, but they account for a very small amount of the variance in spousal homicide. So the first factor is, was the woman a witness of domestic violence in her own home? I would argue in many cases of domestic violence that simply is true. It's not unique to cases of spousal homicide. The next two I think are rather salient. For women, if they're involved in a common law relationship instead of a legal marriage, they're more likely to be murdered by a partner. Not more likely, excuse me, it increases their risk of being murdered by their partner. The same is true if they are more than 10 years younger than their partner. So, so we might see, but I think that also the issue is there that we can't really remove the variance from is socioeconomic status, access to resources and means and things like that. So there are some factors that might be more closely associated, but ultimately we don't do a good job of predicting. So, and the other thing that I was hoping to get to today was to provide sort of a framework about how expert witnesses can work with legal professionals in these risk assessment cases. I think we are pretty much out of time. But what I can do is also, gosh, that was all so very impressive. But the thing is, one thing I think just my perspective is that psychologists in general need to be better about communicating with other professionals. And so I think it's important for legal professionals to be aware of some of these issues and aware of what psychologists and psychiatrists who are expert witnesses can do, but also to be aware of the limitations of what they can do. So if you have questions or things of that nature, or any of those studies you would like access to, or references or things like that, please feel free to email me. It's a super easy email to remember. It's just troy@grandforkstherapy.com. And I think that ultimately, I think it's great though that the Law Review put this event on, because we know that sexual assault and domestic violence cause a lot of suffering for a lot of people, and that ultimately I think we probably need a multidisciplinary approach, a transdisciplinary approach, so that we're all, and by transdisciplinary I mean that we overcome what our discipline is, where we're coming from our perspective, and we all work toward the same mission, which is reducing the pain that it causes humanity, whether that's for the direct victim, whether it's for the families that are affected, and ultimately for the person who has committed the crime moving forward to be a productive citizen. So thank you very much. I'm sorry we really don't have time for questions either. I'm super long-winded, I apologize. But if you have questions, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to answer them. All right, thank you.